Welcome to the Veritas podcast, the show where we study and discuss papal writings of the Catholic Church. Hello and welcome. This is Robert. He's Rob. This is the Veritas podcast. Because this is such a dense episode, we're going to jump right into it. Leo has addressed the so-called freedoms of speech and press. He spoke about the dangers of both as he cautioned against unbridled intellects, preaching to the untutored multitude. Any so-called liberty owes allegiance to God because rights come from Him. But any right should be directed to the truth. Therefore, there cannot be any absolute license to speak what one chooses because it may deviate from the truth. We do not have the right to speak against truth. Pope Leo has spoken of truth so eloquently in the past. He spoke of the true religion. Now, in this episode, he turns his attention to educators, whose job it is to bring truth to the minds of their students. Some claim that teachers should be free to teach whatever theory or idea that comes along. Pope Leo writes about this supposed liberty of teaching. In paragraph 24, he says, quote, "There can be no doubt that truth alone should imbue the minds of men, for in it are found the well-being, the end, and the perfection of every intelligent nature, and therefore nothing but truth should be taught, both to the ignorant and to the educated, so as to bring knowledge to those who have it not, and to preserve it in those who possess it. For this reason, it is plainly the duty of all who teach to banish error from the mind, and by sure safeguards to close the entry to all false convictions." End of quote.
Yeah, the teachers have a duty to teach what's true, and as the Pope said, to banish error from the minds of men. They're not supposed to just be teaching the latest theory, the latest thing that may be true, it may not be true. They're supposed to teach the truth. But in order for a teacher to teach the truth, they have to have the truth. There's a Latin phrase, nemo dat quod non habet, which means a person cannot give what they don't have. So if the teachers don't have the truth, then they can't give the truth to the students. So the teachers need to be trained in the truth so they can then teach the students the truth. And if the teachers have embraced errors, then they'll spread these errors to the students. So how many students today, in America especially, are taught that religious liberty and separation of church and state are errors? They're not taught that. They're taught these are good things. We're proud of religious liberty and separation of church and state. These are embraced as goods, but these are actually errors that are contrary to the faith. So if the teachers are deceived, then they'll convey their errors to the students, and then the students will end up being deceived as well. And earlier this week, the president of St. Thomas University, which is a Catholic college, came out basically in support of gay marriage. She said she based this on the recent comments of Pope Francis over the last few weeks on gay marriage. And there's an article on the school's website. It's titled, "As Catholics Rethink Views on Gays, So Too Do Their Schools." And this is from the article, and within this article they're going to quote the president, the new president of the college. Quote, this is from the article. "Since taking over University of St. Thomas this summer, President Julie Sullivan has heard from gay faculty students that they feel a need to hide on campus. In her recent convocation address, the first lay female president of the Roman Catholic School in St. Paul, Minnesota, vowed to change that." Now here's the quote. This is a quote from their new president, Julie Sullivan. Quote, "It pains me to think that a gay student, staff, or faculty member would ever feel unwelcome or need to hide at St. Thomas. As Pope Francis reminds us, we are not called to judge. We are called to love and support everyone in our community regardless of their sexual orientation, and, I might add, regardless of the gender of their spouse," unquote. And then continuing on in the article, that was a direct quote from the president. This is how the article concludes. Drawing on comment, let's see, how does it conclude? Well, I don't have it right here, but it says that the room then broke into applause after she made her comments. You see, when those responsible for teaching others are themselves deceived, well, the result is going to be complete confusion with the students, which is exactly what we see today in our general population. And there were two recent polls, Gallup poll and the Pew poll, I believe are the two recent polls on gay marriage, and they showed that more than half the population is now in favor of it. It was 53% of the U.S. citizens as a whole, and 60% of Catholics were in favor of it. So a higher percentage of Catholics are in favor of so-called gay marriage than the general corrupt population, which means Catholics on average are even more morally bankrupt than the rest of society. And I hate to say it, but we can thank the hierarchy for this and the teachers at the Catholic schools. But this just goes to show how easily the population can be led into error, even with something so obviously wrong as gay marriage, which is not only contrary to nature, but a sin that cries to heaven for vengeance.
That's an excellent point, Rob. Leo continues in paragraph 25 when he talks about this idea of two truths, natural and supernatural. And Rob, I want you to flesh that out in a minute, but let me continue. In paragraph 26, the Holy Father says that the Church has been handed down certain truths revealed by God. Quote, to this society he entrusted all the truths which he had taught in order that they might keep and guard them, and with lawful authority explain them. Thus it is manifest that man's best and surest teacher is God, the source and principle of all truth, and the only begotten Son, who is in the bosom of the Father, the way, the truth, and the life, which enlightens every man, and to whose teaching all must submit, and they shall be all taught of God. End of quote.
Yeah, that last sentence he read, and quote, they shall all be taught of God, that comes from the Bible. So he's quoting the Bible there. So, yeah, there's a lot we can say about this. We can break the truths out into two general categories, which Pope Leo does, natural truths and supernatural truths. Natural truths are those truths that can be known by the light of reason alone, such as the existence of God. That can be known by the light of reason alone. Okay, that's one set of truths, natural truths. The other set of truths are those that can only be known by divine revelation. For example, the Trinity. So there's some truths that we can arrive at by the use of our reason. We can actually arrive at a lot of truth by the use of our reason. We can arrive at, I mentioned the existence of God. You can arrive at the knowledge that contraception is evil, even though today most people don't believe those. There's many atheists out there. They have been unable to arrive at the belief in the existence of God by their reason alone. And there's people who have not arrived at the belief that contraception is evil by the use of their reason alone. Okay? So there's the natural truths that we can possibly or potentially know by the use of our reason, but that doesn't mean we're always going to know them. It just means they can be known. Okay? Then there's the supernatural truths that no matter how smart you are, you can't figure them out because they're above the level of reason. So you can never arrive at the knowledge of one God in three persons. You can't arrive there. Actually, Aristotle got pretty darn close when he arrived at the knowledge of God. He even got, really, when you look at what he said about God and you know the teaching of the Trinity, you see that Aristotle got pretty darn close, but he didn't get all the way there because you can't arrive at that. So
I think it'd be fair to say, Rob, too, that the rise in atheism in our day, I think, is directly correlated to the really poor education in the school system, the poor education in the Catholic school system as well, in that people have lost the ability to think. Not only do they not know what to think, and that's the divine revealed truths we've talked so much about, but they don't even know how to think. Therefore, they don't know how to arrive at certain conclusions that Aquinas has taken us through, Augustine, and even before him, Aristotle.
Right. Yeah, that's correct. Also, not only have they not been taught how to think, how to reason their way to these conclusions, but they've also been taught errors. And then errors then prevent them from reasoning correctly. They kind of stand as a roadblock in the way of their reasoning. So that's right. But now, back to where we were. The natural truths we said can be known by the light of reason. Supernatural truths can only be known by revelation, and we believe them by faith. But divine revelation doesn't only include supernatural truths. Okay, it's an important point because I don't think a lot of people realize this. Divine revelation includes supernatural truths like the Trinity, the Incarnation, the sacrificial nature of the Mass, purgatory, but it also includes other natural truths that can be known by the light of reason. Now, why would it include truths that can be known by the light of reason, since after all, these can be known by the light of reason? The reason it includes those is, like we mentioned, these truths can be known, but they're usually not known. So the reason God revealed natural truths as well is so that all men could know them immediately with certitude and with no admixture of error. That's how Father Gary Lagrange put it. He said they've been revealed so that all men can know them immediately with certainty and with no admixture of error. Okay, so divine revelation includes the natural truths and also the supernatural truths. It includes all the truths we need to know to get to heaven. Now, the church is the divinely established depository of the revealed truths. Okay? These truths were revealed by Jesus and the apostles and passed on through the succession of bishops through the magisterium of the church. So the church is a divinely established depository of the revealed truths, and it's also the infallible teacher and interpreter of the revealed truths. Okay? It's the church's job to protect these truths, to guard them from error, to protect them, to safeguard them, and also to propose them to the faithful for belief. And it's then the duty of the Catholics, which includes the hierarchy, to accept truths proposed by the church and to adhere to them by faith. So the church is the depository of the revealed truths. It then proposes these truths for belief, and that's what's called the object of faith. It's what it is we're required to believe. So when they propose a truth at a council or an official creed, the truth is proposed, then the Catholic, using the virtue of faith that he received at baptism, which is in his intellect, he then adheres, makes an act of faith, and adheres to those teachings proposed infallibly by the church. Now, one of the problems today is that many in the hierarchy itself no longer believe these truths. And therefore, if they don't believe them, they're not going to teach them to the faithful, and they don't. Cardinal Pell, in Australia, I believe, he had a debate either earlier this year or maybe last year where he openly denied the existence of Adam and Eve, our first parents, which is heresy. See, when the clergy rejects the truth, the faithful are they're in deep trouble, and that's where we are today. The object of faith, what it is we're supposed to be believed, is denied by a lot in the hierarchy, and then it's obscured so that the faithful, they're not quite sure what to believe, and if you're not sure what to believe, how are you going to adhere to it? Or if Cardinal Pell says Adam and Eve were not real people, and if you're a Catholic listening, you're going to adhere to that they weren't, which is false. So it's a lot of confusion today, but that's just the situation that we're in, and we have to do our best to get through it.
Now, Rob, let's take a listen to Cardinal Pell in his own words.
So are you talking about a kind of Garden of Eden scenario with an actual Adam and Eve?
Well, what Adam and Eve terms, what do they mean? Life and earth. It's like every man. That's a beautiful, sophisticated, a mythological account. It's not science, but it's there to tell us two or three things. First of all, that God created the world and the universe. Secondly, that the key to the whole of the universe, the really significant thing, are humans. And thirdly, it's a very sophisticated mythology to try to explain the evil and the suffering of the world.
But it isn't a literal truth. You shouldn't see it in any way as being an historical or literal truth.
It's certainly not a scientific truth, and it's a religious story told for religious purposes.
All right, so moving on, an important distinction comes to mind here, but first let me read paragraph 27, quote, "In faith and in the teaching of morality, God himself made the church a partaker of his divine authority, and through is heavenly gift. She cannot be deceived. She is therefore the greatest and most reliable teacher of mankind, and in her swells an inviolable right to teach them. End of quote. Rob, can you explain the difference between the individual members of the church we've already been talking about, who teach errors, and the church herself, who, quote, cannot be deceived?
Yes. Let me answer it this way. In normal times, a Catholic can trust the priests and the bishops to teach them what the church teaches. Normally, what a priest teaches you, that's going to be what the church teaches. What a bishop says, that's going to be what the church teaches. And what the Pope says is going to be what the church teaches. Since Vatican II, that's no longer the case. Father Joseph de Saint Marie was a Catholic theologian who worked in Rome in the 70s and 80s. He was a scholar on Fatima, and he was a loyal, faithful son of John Paul II. He worked with John Paul II, was a faithful, loyal son of John Paul II. And he even helped John Paul II compose the formula for the 1982 consecration of the world to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. Now, despite this, Father de Saint Marie issued the following warning about the unfortunate state of the church. Okay, so this is a member of the hierarchy, worked in Rome, associate of John Paul II, loyal son of John Paul II, not some radical traditionalist. Okay, this is what he said, quote, "In our time, and it is one of the most obvious signs of the extraordinarily abnormal character of the current state of the Church, it is very often the case that the acts of the Holy See demand of us prudence and discernment," unquote. See, so notice what he said in his delicate way. He said, due to the, quote, extraordinarily abnormal state of the Church, it is very often the case that the acts of the Holy See demand discernment. In other words, in our day, Catholics can't just accept what comes from Rome without examining it. That's the unfortunate situation that we're in today. Now, because of this irregularity with the situation in the Church, we have to make some distinctions between what Catholics must believe and then what we should make observations about or what we don't necessarily have to believe. Again, we shouldn't have these distinctions. Normally, if the Holy See issues something or the Pope says something or your bishop, you can trust that it's correct. You don't have to question. But that's not the case today. So what are we required to believe? All Catholics are required to believe all the official creeds of the Church, okay, and there's a number of them, all the dogmatic pronouncements from the various council, and by the way, there was none in Vatican II. Vatican II is only pastoral. It did not define any new dogmas. So anything infallible in Vatican II is only infallible by virtue of already being defined by the Church or being taught by the ordinary and universal magisterium. In other words, if something has always been taught in Vatican II, just repeated it, well, it's infallible. Or if the Church had previously defined something, such as the Trinity, and then Vatican II repeats the teaching on the Trinity, well, that's also infallible because of what happened before. But nothing new in Vatican II was infallible because Vatican II specifically avoided engaging infallibility. So I just want to make that side note.
Yeah, Rob, let me interject real quick. In 1988, Cardinal Ratzinger said, quote, "The truth is that this particular council defined no dogma at all and deliberately chose to remain on a modest level as a merely pastoral council, and yet many treat it as though it made itself into a sort of super dogma, which takes away the importance of all the rest."
Right, yeah. I wrote an article for The Remnant a year or so ago, which you can search on the Internet. It should pull up, called Papal Infallibility and Its Limitations, and that'll give all the distinctions that are necessary with a lot of explanation. But so back to what we're required to believe. We're required to believe the official creeds of the Church, dogmatic pronouncements from councils, and then any ex cathedra statements of the Pope. But we're not necessarily required to believe everything the Pope or bishops say because of the situation that we've been talking about in the Church. We can't just listen to what the authorities say. Today, we have to take the initiative to study the faith on our own. We have to know what the church teaches. We have to learn it on our own. And the best place to start is the pre-Vatican II catechisms, which all teach the true faith with no admixture of error, and they teach it clearly. So if we just, the situation of the church in some ways is very difficult, but in other ways it's really not. If you just pick up what was taught before Vatican II, you get the older catechisms, read those, you're on solid ground. And if you have any specific issues, just go to one of the older encyclicals, read it, and that will clarify the specific issues. So it's a difficult day at this point, but in other ways it's really not, because all this has already been clear. Fortunately, all of these issues have already been addressed before this crisis was launched, unlike the Arian crisis. The Arian crisis was a lot more difficult. You didn't have nearly as many magisterial. The Arian crisis happened in the 4th century. It was basically a denial of the divinity of Christ. It was the heresy that infected a large portion of the hierarchy. Some estimates, Father Jurgens, who edited the book Faith of Our Fathers, he estimated that between 97 and 99% of the hierarchy was infected with this heresy and denied the divinity of Christ. Now, if you lived at that time as just an ordinary faithful, you'd be in a world of trouble, because you didn't have all these old magisterial documents to go back and refer to, and you didn't have the internet where all this is available at your fingertips. So in some ways, our current crisis is not as difficult because of the access we have to the older information. So if we just pick up an old catechism, study it, believe what it says, we're going to be on safe ground. Now, let's address briefly papal infallibility, because that's misunderstood by a lot of people. People mistakenly believe that the Pope is infallible, and that is actually a very misleading way to phrase papal infallibility. The Pope is not infallible. He's protected from speaking error in very limited situations only. Papal infallibility was defined at the First Vatican Council in 1870, and this is the verbiage from that council that was used to define the dogma. So listen to, this is going to tell when the Pope speaks infallibly. There's 4 conditions contained within this quote I'm about to read. Here's the quote from Vatican I on infallibility. Quote, "We teach and define as a divinely revealed dogma that when the Roman pontiff speaks ex cathedra, that is, when, in the exercise of his office as shepherd and teacher of all Christians, in virtue of his supreme apostolic authority, he defines a doctrine concerning faith and morals to be held by the whole Church. He possesses, by the divine assistance promised to him in Blessed Peter, that infallibility which the divine Redeemer has willed his Church to enjoy in defining doctrines concerning faith or morals," unquote. So there's actually 4 conditions contained within that definition, and they are: 1, that the Pope speaks ex cathedra, which means he speaks with the full exercise of his supreme magisterial authority. That's 1. 2, he has to be defining a dogma, not just saying something, but actually defining something. 3, it has to relate to faith or morals. And 4, he has to be intending to bind the entire universal Church to this teaching. It can't be just for the Latin Rite only. It has to be for the entire Church. So those 4 conditions have to be in place for the divine assistance to be present, because papal infallibility, it's a charism, but it's not a positive charism. It's not something that inspires the Pope to teach something true, and it's not a habitual charism, which means it doesn't abide with him always, like sanctifying grace in our soul. That abides with us always, so it's habitual. Well, infallibility is not habitual, and it's not a positive charism. What is it then? It's a negative charism. All it does is prevent the Pope from erring when those 4 conditions are in place. If those 4 conditions are not in place, he can err, and popes have erred. John the 22nd, who lived in the early 1300s, he's an example that's often brought up of Pope erring. He had written a book before being elected Pope, which taught that the souls of the faithful departed would not possess the beatific vision or the vision of God until after the final judgment and the resurrection of the body. Now, that's false. He wrote in the book before being elected, and then after being elected, he continued to teach that publicly. He taught it in a number of sermons publicly, and it caused a huge commotion in the church because of this, and he held to his error. And there were even some cardinals who wanted to hold a council and condemn him as a heretic, but it never happened. And then on his deathbed, before he died, he renounced his error and actually did so in writing. But what that shows is that a pope can teach error when he is not exercising infallibility. And John the 22nd was not exercising infallibility when he taught that error. Now,
Rob, real quick. A lot of times the popes, they'll do like a famous interview like Pope Francis did, or they might even so-called teach publicly, like we're talking about John the 22nd. But how can we tell when a pope is pronouncing something for the church? For my opinion, obviously, it's going to be in an official document, an encyclical, a bull, something like that.
Yeah. There's not a specific formula that has to be used. There's not like in the Mass you have certain words. There's not a specific formula. But in my article, it's in the Remnant, if you read that, I actually quote some authorities explain that it has to be clear that he is intending to define a dogma for the entire church. That has to be evidently clear. And if it's not evidently clear, then infallibility doesn't apply. So there's no specific formula. It just has to be evidently clear that he is using his supreme apostolic authority to define this particular doctrine to be held by all Catholics. And if you want to do research on the definition of the Immaculate Conception and the definition of the bodily assumption of the Blessed Mother into heaven, you can see how the Pope phrased these definitions. It's usually, we proclaim, define, and profess that all Catholics must believe, X, Y, and Z. It's usually some formula such as that, but there's actually no specific formula that has to be used. It just has to be clear. I alluded.
All right. Rob, that's great coverage of infallibility and the idea of it. So I think that's an excellent point to stop for this episode. Everybody join us next time as we are getting close to the end of Libertas.